Hello everyone and welcome to my channel YNR Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Genoa City had always been a place where secrets survived longer than the people who carried them, where grins were munitions and history no way stayed buried for long, but indeed by its own ruthless norms, the day the mask eventually came off would be flashed back as one of the most ruinous moments the megacity had ever endured. Because this time the verity didn't simply ruin one life, it transferred shockwaves through families, pots, and commitment that had been precisely constructed over decades, and at the center of it all stood Victoria Newman, composed, grim, and eventually finished playing defense. For weeks, perhaps longer than anyone realized, commodity about Sienna had no way sat right with Victoria. It wasn't just the polished confidence or the way Sienna always sounded one step ahead of every discussion. It was the subtle inconsistencies, the stories that nearly lined up but no way relatively betrothed, the way she studied people rather than connected with them, as if everyone in Genoa City were pieces on a chessboard rather than mortal beings with complicated histories. Victoria had learned long ago that instincts weren't novelette-ish effects, they were survival tools stoned by treason, and her instincts had been screaming ever since Sienna entered their world under the guise of reinvention, occasion, and ambition. Victoria didn't rush. She no way did when the stakes were this high. Rather, she watched, heeded, and collected fractions of verity the way her father had tutored her, not through affection but through illustration. She noticed how Sienna replied whenever the Newman name came up in discussion, the flicker of commodity too sharp to be admiration, too subdued to be abomination. She noticed how Sienna avoided certain places in city, how she veered questions about her history with rehearsed ease, and how her smile no way relatively reached her eyes when old family stories surfaced. Genoa City was erected on participated memory, on dishonors rumored and repeated until they came legend, and Sienna moved through it like a sightseer who had learned the guidebook but no way lived the experience. The deeper Victoria looked, the further she realized this wasn't a coexistence but a construction. Records that should have was didn't. Employment histories stopped suddenly and proceeded under different names. References traced back to shell companies that dissolved the moment anyone tried to dig further. Someone had invested a great deal of time and plutocrat into icing Sienna appeared licit, and that alone told Victoria everything she demanded to know. People with nothing to hide didn't abolish themselves this completely. Behind the scenes, Victoria worked still, enlisting the kind of help that didn't ask questions and didn't leave fingerprints. She retraced timelines, cross-checked fiscal trails, and followed vestments that led far beyond Genoa City, into places where the history was buried designedly and individualities were goods rather than birthrights. Each discovery tensed the knot in her casket, not out of fear but out of certainty. Sienna wasn't just hiding commodity, she was someone differently entirely. As the pieces came together, the counter-accusations came insolvable to ignore. Sienna's appearance hadn't been arbitrary. Her connections, her strategic Gemütlichkeit, her calculated propinquity to power all refocused toward a singular purpose. She hadn't come to Genoa City to start over. She had come to finish commodity that had been set in stir times agone. Commodity embedded in grievances that anteceded her assumed name. The day Victoria chose to act wasn't impulsive. It was deliberate, theatrical in its perfection, and devastating in its prosecution. Newman Enterprises was formerly buzzing with pressure that morning, the kind that dallied in the air before storms no bone could see coming. Directors moved through the corridors ignorant that the foundation beneath them was about to crack. Sienna arrived as usual, indefectible and confident, ignorant that the interpretation of herself she had so precisely curated was about to be disassembled in front of everyone who signified. Victoria called the meeting herself. Icing the room was filled not just with directors, but with family, abettors, and rivals likewise. Genoa City thrived on spectacle, and if the verity was going to come out, it would do so where it could no longer be denied or dismissed as scuttlebutt. The doors closed, the room settled, and Victoria stood at the head of the table with the calm authority of someone who had formerly won. She began without blameworthiness, without emotion, speaking rather about trust, about translucency, about how Newman Enterprises had survived because it understood the value of knowing exactly who stood within its walls. Her words were measured, nearly reflective, lullabying the room into a false sense of security. Sienna heeded politely, offering the occasional nod, the faint smile of someone habituated to being undervalued. Also Victoria shifted. She spoke of deception, of the peril of allowing unknown variables into positions of influence, of how the history had a way of resurfacing no matter how deeply it was buried. The air in the room grew heavier with every judgment. People changed ganders, doubtful where this was going, but acutely apprehensive that commodity was unfolding that couldn't be stopped. When Victoria eventually said Sienna's name, it landed like a blast. She didn't roar. She didn't depict. She simply stated that Sienna wasn't who she claimed to be. That the identity she had presented was a fabrication, strictly assembled but unnaturally false. The room erupted, voices lapping, unbelief and confusion spreading like campfire. Sienna's expression set, just for a moment, before she masked it with outrage and denial, but Victoria had formerly moved past the point of argument. Substantiation followed, displayed with ruthless effectiveness. Documents, timelines, photos, fiscal records, all clustering toward a single conclusion. Sienna's real identity, long abandoned and designedly concealed, was laid bare for everyone to see. The name itself carried weight, connected to old injuries and undetermined conflicts that numerous in the room had hoped were long behind them. Gasps echoed, chairpersons shifted, and the reality of it all began to sink by. Genoa City had been sneaked, not by accident but by design. As the verity settled, the emotional fallout was immediate and visceral. Those who had trusted Sienna felt betrayed, questioning their own judgment and alliances. Those who had misdoubted her felt vindicated but shaken by how close they had come to being manipulated. Family members grappled with the consummation that their history had formerly again set up a way to hang their present. Victoria remained steady throughout it all, her expression revealing nothing but resoluteness. This wasn't about particular satisfaction or vengeance. This was about control, about reclaiming narrative power in a megacity where stories were frequently weaponized. By exposing Sienna intimately, Victoria assured that there would be no room for spin, no quiet escape, no reinvention staying just around the corner. The verity, formerly spoken audibly in that room, couldn't be undone. Sienna, for her part, oscillated between fury and despair. Denial gave way to wrathfulness to cold computation, as she realized the depth of Victoria's medication and the impossibility of risking the taradiddle she had lived. The mask hadn't slipped, it had been torn down, leaving her exposed in a room full of people who now saw her not as an asset, but as a trouble that had been annulled. Security was called, not as a dramatic flourish but as a formality. Sienna's access was abandoned, her authority annulled in real time. The conglomerate she had worked so hard to access shut its doors to her with the same effectiveness it formerly reserved for challengers and adversaries. Word spread snappily, as it always did in Genoa City. Within hours the story dominated every rumored discussion, every private call, every tense family gathering. The disclosure forced old secrets back into the light, continuing debates about fidelity, heritage, and whether anyone in the megacity could ever truly escape who they were. For Victoria, the fate was quieter but no less violent. She knew that exposing Sienna was only the morning, that consequences would ripple outward in ways no bone could completely prognosticate. Adversaries infrequently faded simply because they were unmasked. But for the first time in a long while Victoria felt commodity close to peace. She had trusted her instincts, followed the verity wherever it led, and refused to be manipulated by sentiment or mistrustfulness. Genoa City reeled, alliances shifted, and the power dynamics that had defined the city for time subtly realigned. The mask had come off, and in doing so, it reminded everyone of a verity they frequently forgot in Genoa City. Reinvention was no way endless, and the once always collected its debts. As night fell and the megacity lights flitted on, one thing was certain. Nothing would ever be the same again. Victoria had drawn a line that couldn't be cancelled, and Sienna's exposure had come more than a reproach. It had come a warning. In Genoa City, secrets could survive, but lies no way did. The hours after Sienna's exposure didn't bring relief to Genoa City, only a deeper, more unsettling silence, the kind that settled after an earthquake when everyone was still counting what remained standing and what had still collapsed beneath their bases. People went home, but sleep didn't come fluently. Phones buzzed late into the night with questions no bone knew how to answer. Who had known? Who had helped her? And most importantly, why now, after all these times, had she chosen this moment to resurface under a espoused name and an immaculate taradiddle? Victoria sat alone in her office long after the structure voided, the megacity lights reflecting off the glass like fractured recollections. Exposing Sienna had needed absolute certainty, yet certainty didn't abolish consequence. She replayed every decision in her mind, not with remorse but with computation. Power, she knew, was no way stationary. It shifted with information, with perception, with timing. Tonight, the balance had listed in her favor, but hereafter would demand commodity more. Genoa City no way allowed palms to remain uncontested. Across city, Sienna faced a veritably different reckoning. The confidence that formerly shielded her now felt like armor too heavy to carry. She moved through the murk of a megacity that no longer ate her, apprehensive that every familiar road corner held new meaning. Faces she formerly saluted with ease now represented judgment, dubitation, and the implied understanding that her story had been rewritten without her concurrence. The verity, formerly exposed, had stripped down not only her position but the vision of control she had cleaved to for so long. What many people understood was that Sienna hadn't always planned to return. The history she abandoned had been unattractive, painful, and shaped by backstabbings that left scars deeper than anyone in Genoa City could imagine. Reinvention hadn't been a luxury, it had been survival. She had learned to construct herself piece by piece, choosing names, histories, and intentions the way others chose clothes, until the taradiddle felt more real than the verity ever had. But undetermined injuries had a way of calling people home, and Genoa City had been calling her for times. The coming morning, the fallout came insolvable to contain. Boardrooms buzzed with enterprise. Families gathered around breakfast tables pretending normality, while quietly calculating how the disclosure might affect their futures. Trust, formerly shaken, proved delicate to restore. Long-time alliances felt fragile, and indeed the most stable connections were tested by the memorial that anyone could be hiding commodity ruinous beneath a precisely curated face. Victoria faced scrutiny from every direction. Some praised her resoluteness, calling it necessary, indeed heroic. Others questioned her motives, wondering whether the exposure had been driven by instinct or strategy. She accepted neither praise nor review, understanding that leadership infrequently swung the comfort of universal blessing. What signified was that the trouble had been annulled, at least for now. But annulled didn't mean excluded. In private moments, Victoria allowed herself to reflect on what Sienna represented beyond the deception. She saw a woman shaped by loss, wrathfulness, and ambition, not unlike herself. The difference lay in choice. Victoria had brazened her once head-on, claiming it as part of her identity rather than burying it under aliases and half-trueness. In Genoa City, survival frequently depended on which interpretation of oneself one was willing to come. Meanwhile, whispers began to surface about how Sienna had managed to bypass safeguards that should have stopped her long before she reached the inner circle. Examinations were launched still, digging into security breaches, compromised systems, and the possibility that someone on the inside had looked the other way. Paranoia spread, turning associates into suspects and musketeers into implicit arrears. The exposure had cracked open more than one secret, and everyone felt the earthquake. Sienna, insulated but not defeated, began to reassess her options. Leaving Genoa City altogether sounded logical, yet commodity held her back. Maybe it was pride, maybe untreated business, or maybe the consummation that running again would only confirm the narrative others had assessed on her. She had been unmasked, yes, but the story was far from over. In Genoa City, redemption and vengeance were frequently separated by the thinnest of lines. As days passed, the megacity acclimated to its new reality. Captions shifted, exchanges evolved, but the underpinning pressure remained. Victoria proceeded her part with renewed authority, her conduct buttressing a character for alert and strength. She understood that exposure had consequences beyond Sienna. It served as a communication to anyone who believed they could manipulate the Newman heritage without consequence. Yet indeed Victoria tasted that this chapter was incomplete. Truth had a way of demanding fate. Connections fractured by the disclosure would need reckoning. The ghosts of old grievances, formerly stirred, would not return still to rest. And Sienna, now stripped of her disguise, still held commodity dangerous, nothing left to lose. On a quiet evening, as Genoa City palpitated with its usual meter of ambition and desire, both women stood on contrary sides of a conflict that had only just begun. One represented order reclaimed, the other chaos exposed. Their paths, formerly cutting under false pretenses, were now irrevocably bound by verity. The mask had come off, but what remained underneath was far more complicated than anyone had anticipated. And in a megacity erected on secrets, that complexity promised only one thing. The storm was far from over. In the days that followed, Genoa City did what it always did best when brazened with chaos. It acclimated, absorbed, and still prepared for the coming implosion. On the face, routines proceeded. Coffee was poured at society, deals were negotiated behind unrestricted doors, and families gathered under the same roofs where secrets had been passed down like heritages. But beneath that fragile normality, the megacity palpitated with apprehension, because Sienna's exposure had reminded everyone of an uncomfortable verity. No matter how precisely constructed a life might be, it could still collapse in a single enduring moment. Victoria felt the shift. Far and wide she went. Exchanges stopped when she entered apartments. People watched her more nearly now, not with fear exactly, but with a stropped mindfulness. She had drawn blood without vacillation, and Genoa City admired that. Yet respect was frequently accompanied by distance. Power insulated as much as it defended, and Victoria accepted that price with the quiet discipline she had inherited and ameliorated over times of hard assignments. Internally, Newman Enterprises moved into damage control mode. Checkups were expanded, access points reviewed, and long-standing contracts scanned under a new lens of dubitation. Every superintendent understood that Sienna's deception wasn't simply a particular treason but a structural failure that couldn't be allowed to repeat itself. The company's heritage depended on alert, and complacency was no longer an option. At the same time, rumors swirled that Sienna's true identity carried legal consequences far beyond commercial embarrassment. Old records resurfaced, connections long dismissed as inapplicable suddenly appeared disturbingly current, and questions arose about whether her return to Genoa City had been driven by untreated legal business as much as particular vendetta. Law enterprises prepared still. Strategies were drawn. Everyone tasted that the story was evolving into commodity that would not remain contained within boardrooms and rumored exchanges. Sienna, meanwhile, lived in a state of suspended reality. The megacity that formerly felt like a stage where she could perform any part she chose had converted into a maze of monuments of who she used to be, and who she could no longer pretend to be. She avoided familiar places not out of shame but out of computation. Every hassle carried threat now, every regard an implicit spark that could enkindle farther scrutiny. Yet insulation had its own troubles. Left alone with her studies, Sienna began to defy the verity she had spent times running from. She had come back to Genoa City not just to reclaim power, but to defy the ghosts she had no way truly escaped. Her wrathfulness toward the history had fueled her ambition, but now that ambition had been exposed, stripped of its disguise, leaving raw emotion in its place. Victoria's name echoed constantly in Sienna's mind, not as an adversary alone but as a glass. Both women had been shaped by treason, by prospects they no way asked for, by surroundings where weakness was penalized and control equated to survival. The difference was that Victoria had chosen to defy her demons in the open, while Sienna had tried to overrun hers under layers of fabrication. That consummation unsettled her further than the exposure itself. As the weeks unfolded, Genoa City began to fracture along unnoticeable lines. Some believed Sienna merited what happened to her, viewing the exposure as a necessary correction in a megacity that had permitted too numerous accessible falsehoods. Others questioned whether Victoria had gone too far, arguing that public demotion was an atrocity disguised as justice. The debate strained into private connections, testing commitment and continuing injuries that had no way completely healed. Victoria remained intimately silent on the matter, refusing to justify or explain her conduct. Her silence spoke volumes. She had made her move and stood by it. In private still, she scuffled with the consequences in ways many people would ever see. Leadership demanded certainty, but humanity demanded reflection. She understood that by exposing Sienna, she hadn't only defended her family and company, she had also altered the line of another life irrevocably. That mindfulness counted heavily on her during rare moments of solitariness. She redefined the substantiation, the timelines, the opinions, searching not for miscalculations, but for meaning. Had Sienna been a villain from the morning, or a product of circumstances that Genoa City itself had helped produce? The question dallied without answer, and maybe that query was the true cost of power. The pressure reached a new peak when whispers of an implicit legal showdown came insolvable to ignore. Processes were bandied in hushed tones. Old alliances resurfaced, not out of fidelity but necessity. Genoa City braced itself for the possibility that Sienna's exposure was simply the opening act in a much larger reckoning. Sienna, seeing the shift, began to prepare for battle rather than escape. She gathered what coffers she had left, reaching out to connections from a once life she had hoped no way to admit again. Survival instincts demurred in, stoned by despair. She understood that she could no longer calculate on charm or misdirection. However, she'd do so as herself, stripped of pretense but not of resoluteness, if she was going to face Genoa City. When the ineluctable hassle between the two women eventually impended, it felt less like a collision and more like a confluence. Two forces shaped by the same terrain, bound by history, standing on contrary sides of a verity neither could completely escape. Their conflict was no longer about identity alone. It was about responsibility, heritage, and the question of whether reinvention was an act of courage or poltroonery. Genoa City watched nearly, seeing that whatever came next would review the balance of power yet again. The mask had come off, yes, but what followed exposure was always more dangerous than the deception itself. Truth had a way of demanding resolution, and resolution frequently came at a price no bone was prepared to pay. As the megacity moved forward, one reality came necessary. Sienna's unmasking had ended a story. It had begun one far more unpredictable, one that would test not only Victoria's authority, but her persuasions. In a place where survival depended on knowing when to strike and when to stand still, the coming move would determine far further than character. Genoa City had been stunned, shaken, and converted. And as the murk dragged and intention still reignited, the megacity braced itself formerly more, because the verity, formerly unleashed, no way traveled alone.